Hi, welcome to Chapter 17, the endocrine system. Today I'm going to describe the functions of the endocrine system that categorize the two groups of hormones on their molecular basis, review the stimulus, the target, and the action of the structures identified as endocrine glands, and then describe some abnormal endocrine function. So hopefully you've already read Chapter 17 in your textbook. So here we go. So what do you know about the endocrine system? Take a second, really think about it. So the endocrine system is considered the second messenger system of the body. What do you think is the first one? Hopefully you said the nervous system. The nervous system is going to be the first messenger system of the body. It is faster and short acting, whereas the endocrine system is longer acting, but also it's slower to respond. It uses chemical messages. We call those chemical messages hormones, and those hormones are going to be released into the blood. You remember that we've talked about exocrine glands. Those are going to be excreting something that's going to go out of the body or not into the blood, and then the endocrine system is going directly into the blood. These hormones are going to control several major processes of your body. So when we compare and contrast the endocrine system to the nervous system, you can see that both of them are actually using chemical messengers. The nervous system uses what we call neurotransmitters, and the endocrine system uses hormones. So for the endocrine system, it can be a long or short distance, but the nervous system is always very short, right? We have to do it at a synapse. The response time for the endocrine system, it can be fast or slow, but in the case of the nervous system, it is always very fast. And then in the environment, we're always looking at the internal response as far as our endocrine system, whereas the nervous system can be internal or external. The hormones are going to control reproduction, growth and development, the mobilization of our body's defenses, maintenance of much of homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis is maintaining a balance regardless of what's happening on the outside of the body, like temperature control, metabolism, right? Regulation of metabolism, body temperature. So just to kind of review what are hormones, hormones are produced by specialized cells, and they secrete those hormones into our extracellular fluids. So eventually it's going to end up into our blood. The blood is going to transfer those hormones to the target sites or the target cell, and it is very specific. So in this little image here, you can see these are those hormones. The hormones have to hit a specific receptor within the target cell. This is not a target cell. It does not have a receptor for that hormone. Therefore, it has no effect on that cell. The hormones are going to regulate the activity of other cells. There's different hormone classes. We have the amine hormones, the peptide hormones, and the protein hormones. We also have the steroid hormones. Now, the proteins, the amines, the peptides, and the proteins, those are all going to be water soluble, meaning that if you were to put them into water, they could dissolve. Whereas the steroids are considered lipid or fat soluble or water insoluble, okay? Meaning that if we put them into water, they would not dissolve. So the steroid hormones that we most often are going to talk about are going to be our testosterone, progesterone, estrogen. These are going to be our sex hormones, are always going to be the steroid hormones. Now, how do hormones actually act on those tissues? So remember, they have an effect on only those certain tissues, those target cells or the organs, because they have to have those specific protein receptors. The hormone that's going to bind is going to influence the working of the cells. Usually it's going to cause it to do sorts of transcription to create something new. So what kind of effects can we see? Number one, we can see a change in the plasma membrane. So are we going to allow more stuff in? That's the permeability into that plasma membrane. Remember that cell is covered over into a cell membrane, has that double phospholipid bilayer. It can also change the electrical state. Remember, we've talked about action potential when we learned about muscles and the nervous system, right? And so are we going to allow it to, is it going to be more positive or more negative, okay? Synthesis of proteins, such as enzymes, are going to be able to make some enzymes because those enzymes are very specific. They work only with certain substrates, and they help to sort of speed up a reaction by lowering the energy required. We can activate those enzymes, turn them on, or we can inactivate, turn them off. We can also stimulate mitosis, meaning that we're going to cause the more cells to be copied. So here's just a quick review of intracellular communication. So this is how our cells communicating with one another. Okay, so there's direct communication. This is where we have gap junctions. So they're kind of touching one another and they're connected by connexons. Okay, we have paracrine communication, and this is where we use what are called paracrine factors. And so we do this through the extra fluid. It's a very localized spot, and the target cells are going to have appropriate receptors. There's endocrine communication. This is our endocrine system. We do it through the bloodstream with hormones, only acting on target cells because those cells have to have that appropriate receptor. And then we have the synaptic communication. So this is across the synapse. There's neurotransmitters using in our nervous system. So how do the different hormones act within a cell? So there's the steroid hormone action. Remember, these are going to be the ones that are lipid soluble or water insoluble. Okay, so lipid soluble hormones are able to diffuse directly through that plasma membrane. They're able to go through the double layer right here, okay, into the cytoplasm. Once that happens, it's going to bind to a receptor within the cytoplasm, and it forms what's called the receptor hormone complex. That can then enter into the nucleus, and it can trigger gene transcription. So remember, when we're going to make a protein, we have to go through transcription because that's going to copy our DNA into messenger RNA. And then we can do translation, where we're going to transcribe that messenger RNA. It's going to be translated into the proteins. Those proteins can be activated and they can alter that cell activity. Right? The non-steroid hormone action, the water-soluble hormones, those cannot pass through the cell membrane. And so they actually have to bind to a receptor on that cell membrane. When that happens, it's going to activate what's called a G protein. That G protein is then going to activate adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase is going to catalyze ATP. Remember, ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and that's going to catalyze it to CAMP or CAMP, cyclic AMP. It's referred to as many different ways, but it's cyclic AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate. And that cyclic AMP can then activate what's called a protein kinase. Those protein kinases are then going to phosphorylate. That means it's going to add a phosphate to the proteins within the cytoplasm, and that activates it. It turns them on. You can see that it doesn't have anything to do with the nucleus like we see here with our steroid action. Okay. There's 3 ways to stimulate our endocrine glands to work. We have hormonal. And so hormonal means that we're using a hormone to therefore stimulate another hormone to be released. There's humoral. That should be an O right there, not an E. My apologies. Humoral means that it has to do with the humor or the blood, the fluid, the liquid within our body. And so it's like a concentration of an ion within our blood. And then neural means that our nervous system is actually controlling it, okay? So when we talk about that hormonal stimuli, is that the endocrine glands are activated by other hormones, okay? So the hypothalamus is going to secrete some hormones, and those hormones are going to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland, okay? And so those hormones are stimulating here, and then those hormones are going to then stimulate more hormones, okay? So that's hormonal. Humoral is to stimulate when we have a concentration, like a blood concentration. So blood calcium levels, blood glucose levels, okay? Those are going to activate those parathyroid glands to release PTH or parathyroid hormone. We might see the release of calcitonin here, or glucose causing the release of insulin and glucagon. Okay. And then neural stimulase. This is when we have a nerve impulse stimulating that hormone release. Okay, so we see this in times of stress, for instance, so that we can get the release of epi and norepinephrine. Okay, we also see it with the hypothalamus triggering the posterior pituitary release of oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Okay, the hypothalamus actually makes the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone, and then it gets stored in the posterior pituitary to be released later. So most of the time we see a hormonal feedback is a negative feedback response, right? So in a negative feedback response is that we sense an imbalance, we get a hormone release, we correct, and then it's going to turn itself off because we're back down to normal, okay? But oxytocin and prolactin are not negative feedback. They're actually positive feedback, right? And so in a positive feedback case, we're going to keep stimulating and stimulating and stimulating, right? So why would that make sense? Like, what does oxytocin and prolactin do? So oxytocin, you may have actually heard of Pitocin. That's something that we give to pregnant women to help to stimulate labor, right? And so oxytocin is released as the uterus contracts, okay? So it causes uterine contractions, and then as the uterus contracts, it causes the release of more oxytocin and more oxytocin. So that's that positive feedback mechanism that you've talked about when you learned about positive feedback in childbirth. Okay? And prolactin has to do with breastfeeding, right? And so the more that the baby suckles, the more prolactin is going to get released, which means more milk is going to be released. So where are our endocrine glands? Okay, so we have the pineal gland and the pituitary gland up here at the brain. Okay, we have the thyroid in the lower part of the neck. We have the thymus sitting sort of anterior to the heart, the adrenal glands sitting on the kidneys, the pancreas here right there by those kidneys, the uterus for females, as well as there you can see those ovaries right there on the uterus. The uterus itself is not technically an endocrine organ, although it does have action with the oxytocin, and then the testes for a male. Okay. So the pineal gland actually releases melatonin. It is part of the epithalamus. So when darkness occurs, the pineal gland is going to secrete melatonin. Melatonin helps us to trigger in that sleep center, and that helps us to induce sleep. In the morning, the light is going to help to degrade the melatonin, and that shuts off our sleep cycle. Unfortunately, we've kind of ruined this with the invention of smartphones, even electricity itself. It has sort of interrupted this process for us. The hypothalamus pituitary complex is where we have that hypothalamus. Here it is. Okay. And then it's attached to the pituitary with the infundibulum. Okay. And so the hypothalamus controls the pituitary hormone release. We have certain hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary, certain ones that are stored within the posterior pituitary, and it is very tightly regulated by the hypothalamus. Okay. So for instance, we have 3 mechanisms of the hypothalamic control over our endocrine function. So for the first part, we have the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin being produced by the hypothalamus here, okay, and then stored within the posterior pituitary, okay. We also see that it has that regulatory control, okay, so we have a neural control happening here. We also have that regulatory hormone control, okay, and we have control of sympathetic output to our adrenal medulla right here, secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So we have that control here of the anterior pituitary, we have the control here for the release at the posterior pituitary, and then we have the control here at our adrenal glands, okay? The pituitary gland is about the size of a grape. It hangs by that stalk, which we call the infundibulum. It's protected by the sphenoid bone. It sort of sits into the fun sort of cellator area, if you remember that. And it has 2 functional lobes, that anterior and the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is fully glandular tissue. It is, in fact, an endocrine gland. Posterior pituitary, though, has both nervous tissue and glandular tissue. So remember, the release of those hormones is controlled by releasing and inhibiting hormones that are produced at the thalamus. The hypothalamus produces ADH and oxytocin. Those then get transported to neurosecretory cells at the posterior pituitary. But the posterior pituitary, it doesn't make hormones, right? It's just a storage facility. That hypothalamic pituitary portal system, you'll see it HPP. Sometimes you see it even as HPA. So lots of different abbreviations that you'll see. It's just really just a series of blood vessels. It's going to deliver those releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus to the cells of the pituitary. So there's 6-ish anterior pituitary hormones, and the reason that we say 6-ish is because there's one that's kind of maybe, we're not sure. And their characteristics of all those anterior pituitary hormones is that they're going to be protein hormones. So think back there, that tells us that it's going to act through that second messenger system. We're probably going to see that cyclic AMP and the G protein. Okay? And it's regulated by the hormonal stimuli, and it's mostly going to be negative feedback. Okay, and so here we are, we have the TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. It's going to act on the thyroid. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is going to act on the adrenal cortex. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. LH is luteinizing hormone. We also have growth hormone and prolactin. So those are our 6. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We also have endorphins, and endorphins are maybe a hormone, maybe not. Okay, so that's why we say 6-ish. Okay, so the growth hormone is a general metabolic hormone. This helps us to grow, right? So we talked about this when we talked about the skeletal system and the muscular system, right? So the major effects of that growth hormone is that we're going to see the growth of our skeletal muscles and our long bones. It causes our amino acids to be built into proteins to be stored as the muscles, and we also can cause that fats to be broken down as a source of energy, right? And so both of those are going to affect growth. So here we have growth hormone releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. Okay, and then that's then going to cause the release of glucose or growth hormone. Growth hormones give us what's called the glucose-sparing effect. So it causes our adipose cells to break down stored fat so that we can grow. Okay. We're going to see an increase of uptake of amino acids from the blood. They're going to be stored in our muscle cells. We're going to enhance cellular proliferation. That means growing. We also reduce apoptosis. Apoptosis is programmed cell death, meaning that the cells themselves aren't going to die. We're going to be adding more and more and more cells without the cells dying off. Okay. And then we have growth hormone inhibiting hormone right here. Okay. So this is an inhibition of that growth hormone. And that happens here because we have what's called a diabetogenic effect. The growth hormone stimulates our liver to break down glycogen into glucose. Remember, glycogen is glucose plus glucose plus glucose, right? We all stored it up as glycogen. And that helps us to fuel our growth effects. But when that happens, we release IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which also helps us to do all of these fun things with these growth effects. That release of IGF-1 is going to turn off our growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay. So some functions of our other anterior pituitary hormones. We have prolactin. Prolactin is going to stimulate and maintain our milk production following childbirth. I talked about prolactin. It's that positive feedback. We're kind of not sure what's happening with males there, but they do in fact have prolactin. We have adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. It regulates the endocrine activity of the adrenal cortex. We see this released during stress responses. And then we have thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, and that's going to influence the growth and the activity of the thyroid. And we have our gonadotropic hormones. These regulate the hormonal activity of the gonads. So we have follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. That's going to cause our follicle development in the ovaries, and we stimulate our sperm development in the testes. But we also have luteinizing hormone that fits into this gonadotropic hormone. It triggers ovulation in females. It causes ruptured follicles to become what's called the corpus luteum. We're going to talk about that in great detail when we get to our reproductive system, and it's going to stimulate testosterone production in males. It's referred to as interstitial cell stimulating hormone, or ICSH. Okay. So the hormones of the posterior pituitary, right here we have the ADH and the oxytocin. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. If you know what a diuretic is, a diuretic helps us to decrease our water retention, meaning that we would urinate more or let more out. Okay, so ADH, antidiuretic hormone, means that we are going to hold that water in at our kidney tubules. Okay, and then we have oxytocin, which acts on our mammary glands and our uterine muscles. So oxytocin, remember, it helps to stimulate the contractions of the uterus during labor, causes milk ejection, and it's a positive feedback. ADH can inhibit our urine production. We also cause it vasopressin. Okay, and in large amounts, it can actually cause vasoconstriction. And when we constrict our vessels, remember that's going to increase the resistance of our vessels, right? It makes them smaller. If you think about a water hose, if you were to squeeze a water hose, it would make the pressure coming out of that more, okay? And so we're going to increase the blood pressure in that way. Here's a fun chart for you. This is from your textbook, and I encourage you to actually memorize it. Okay. This is that same information just presented in a little bit of a different way. These are going to be our major pituitary pathways. This was a question that is really something that you guys should be able to do. You should go from that hormone itself and as far as what's the hormone and then what's the target and the effects. Okay, so that thyroid gland, remember, it's found at the base of the throat. It consists of two lobes and it connects at the center point, which is called the isthmus. Within the thyroid, we have follicular cells. Follicular cells produce those thyroid hormones. We also have C cells, and C cells produce calcitonin in response to blood calcium levels. The parathyroid gland are little tiny masses on the back surface of the thyroid, and they secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH. PTH helps us to stimulate osteoclasts. If you remember, osteoclasts are the ones that are going to break them down, our bone, and so it helps us to remove that calcium from the bone. It stimulates kidneys and intestines to absorb more calcium, and that therefore helps us to raise our calcium levels in the blood. So here is our thyroid hormone. So the thyroid hormone is our major metabolic hormone. So that means, like, how are we processing the foods that we eat? If we're breaking them down, building them back up, right? Because metabolism is the sum of our anabolic and our catabolic reactions. So our building up and our breaking down, okay? And that also has to do with body temperature. The thyroid hormones are composed of two active iodine-containing hormones. So you have T4, or thyroxine. Thyroxine is secreted by our thyroid follicles. The reason we call it T4 is because it has 4 iodine molecules attached to it. And then we have triiodothyronine. And triiodothyronine is T3. Okay? And what happens is that once the T4 gets to those tissues, the tissues themselves can convert it to T4 or back down to T3. So there's just by pulling off or adding on an iodine. Okay. So this is sort of our thyroid follicles. The thyroid follicles is the functional unit of the thyroid gland. So you can see it's sort of created this follicle right there. There's the follicle cavity. So here's our follicle cavity there. Okay. And so what you'll see here is here's our iodide ions. The iodide ions down here at number 1, they are going to be sort of pumped in, and they're pumped in through what's called a TSH sensitive ion pump. So that ion, the TSH, sort of activates it, okay, to start seeing that ion getting pumped in, okay. That iodide is then going to diffuse sort of through that follicle cells, and it's going to enter into the follicle cavity. It goes through an enzyme called thyroid peroxidase. Okay. And when that happens, it's going to sort of bind into thyroglobulin or globulin. Okay. And those are going to contain our T3 and our T4. Okay. Then we going to, through endocytosis, sort of bring it all back in. Okay. And then we're here at number 5. We do what's called lysozymal digestion. And then we have our T4 and our T3 can then diffuse out, and they actually are going to go into this carrier protein. It could be TBG, transthyretin, or albumin. You may have heard of albumin, or you'll hear of it soon when we talk about blood. And then that can then be released into the blood system. Okay, and so here in homeostasis, we have normal T3 and T4 bodies. We have a normal body temperature, all is good. But if we get a low blood concentration of T3 or T4, or we get a low body temperature, then our hypothalamus is going to release TRH, or thyroid releasing hormone. That's then going to cause our anterior pituitary to release TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. That's then going to cause those thyroid follicles to release T3 and T4, and hopefully we'll have homeostasis restored. Okay, I'm going to stop right here for our first part of the endocrine system, and we'll pick back up in just a bit on the second part of the endocrine system.